So I want to tell you tonight about something that happened quite a while ago. It was about 20 years ago. About 20 years ago, I officiated at a graveside funeral at Sleepy Hollow Cemetery. I have very few funerals at Sleepy Hollow Cemetery because most Jews prefer to be buried in a specifically Jewish cemetery, or at least the Jewish section of a more general cemetery, and there is no officially consecrated Jewish section at Sleepy Hollow. Big surprise. But in this particular case, the deceased was Jewish and his wife was not. And I actually think that she was looking for a neutral site, one where she could feel comfortable one day being laid to rest next to him. And she wanted it to be a fully Jewish funeral. Her only unusual request was that at the end of the funeral, she be allowed to have a bagpiper play Amazing Grace. She even suggested, I think quite aware, she even suggested that if I was uncomfortable with that, she would wait until I had left the cemetery to have him play. Now, I can understand why she thought I might be uncomfortable. The hymn, originally called Faith's Review and Expectation, now known as Amazing Grace from its first two words, was written in England in 1779 by John Newton, who had an interesting life. You should look it up. But the short version is that Newton had become a minister after his conversion to evangelism and the abandonment of his first career as a slave trader. And he had actually also spent some time himself enslaved in Africa to a queen of one of the tribes who was married to another slave trader. It was a very strange story. But that personal history helps to explain the lyrics of the hymn. You very likely know at least the first verse. I am not going to sing it. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see. You did know it. It'd be a closing song. Reverend Newton attributes his ability in this hymn, his ability to now see what he's referring to as the evils of slavery. He attributes his ability to see that to God's grace, amazing grace. He was blind and lost before, but now he is found and he can see the truth. He has become a better human being, not through actions of his own, but through grace. Not because he deserved God's intervention, but simply through the grace of God. Back to the funeral. The grieving widow was a little surprised when I told her I'd like to stay to hear the rendition of Amazing Grace. I happen to love bagpipes. And more to the point, I wanted to stay because actually the concept of grace is a very Jewish one. And you may be surprised yourself to learn that grace is a long-held, inherently Jewish idea. And if you are surprised, it's likely because we don't really use that word in Judaism very much, at least not in English. We do sometimes refer to the Hebrew blessing we recite after eating, Birkat Hamazon, as grace after meals. But by and large, growing up, I don't know if I ever really heard the word, and we seem to have ceded the concept of God's grace to our Christian brethren. But as I say, it has a very long history in Judaism. The Hebrew word for grace is chen. And as early as the book of Exodus, 3,200 years ago, God appeared to Moses with this self-definition, proclaiming on Mount Sinai, Adonai, Adonai, El Rachum Vechanun. Adonai, Adonai is a God compassionate and gracious. God is Chanun, gracious, from the root chen, grace. It is also from the root Chen, grace, we get the feminine name Chana and the masculine names Hanan and Hanania. And you heard, or you will hear tomorrow, the word Chen. It appears in our prayer books as well. Sim shalom tova uvracha, Chen v'chesed v'rachamim. Grant us peace, goodness, and blessing, grace, kindness, and compassion. So, Chen, grace, not chrein, horseradish. Chen. Chen is part of God's self-definition, and it is also something we ask for from God. But when we ask for forgiveness, when we ask for grace, what is it actually that we are asking for? What actually is grace? What do we mean as Jews when we use that word in our prayers? So the best explanation I've ever seen is the one given by Rabbi Elliot Dorff from the American Jewish University in Los Angeles. He reminds us that the word appears in the second line of the priestly benediction. It's the one that starts, Yivarechecha Adonai v'yishmerecha. The second line is, Ya'er Adonai panav elecha v'chunecha. Chunecha, your chen, your grace. I've always translated it, though, and seen it translated as, may God's face shine upon you and be gracious to you. In effect, may God deal graciously with you. And I have to tell you that my whole life, till about 2 weeks ago when I started working on this, I always felt that the phrase, the English phrase, may God deal graciously with you, means that God is being nice. In my mind, gracious is a synonym for nice, right? Someone is gracious. They're nice. In effect, I thought it meant, may God treat you well, which is not a bad translation, and it's certainly not a bad wish. But Rabbi Dorff translates it completely differently. He suggests that the phrase, Ya'er Adonai panav elecha v'chuneka, really means, may God grant you more than you deserve. May God grant you more than you deserve. He is saying that when we ask for God's chen, when we ask for God's grace, we are asking for a blessing that we may have done nothing to merit. Grace is a boon. It is a blessing we receive from a gracious and loving God simply because God is gracious and loving. And this is what Jews mean when we use the word chen, grace. And by the way, it's also what the Christians mean. Grace is a gift given by God for no other reason than God gives it to us. But having said that, having shown you that the idea of grace has a Jewish pedigree, I still think it's a difficult concept to wrap our own heads around. Grace is something we get not as a result of any work we have done. Grace comes to us just because. Jews are not accustomed to that. We have generally been taught that, with some exceptions, for sure, whatever goodness, whatever blessings we find in life are related to what we do to achieve them. Success in whatever area of life, work, relationships, even health, depends largely upon the energy and effort we are willing to put into them. We want to believe, and we are often correct, that what we have achieved, we have deserved. We have earned. We did it. We made it happen. But when we are honest with ourselves, we know there is almost always something more to it than that. Even the most earned success has within it at least a small measure of something else. You might call it serendipity, luck, or you might call it grace. A different funeral story. This one from only 5 days ago. 5 days ago, I officiated at the funeral of the 98-year-old father of a good friend of mine, who also happens to be a rabbi. In his eulogy, Dan spoke about his father's successes, and then he said that when speaking about his own life, his father always added the following: "All my good fortune, everything I have, everything I've accomplished, result from the decision of my father, the former Tsarist conscript, and my mother, the village girl from Russia, to emigrate to the United States." Dan's father worked incredibly hard during his life, and he was justifiably proud of his many successes, and yet he always understood and he always made sure to articulate to his family that what he accomplished, what he was in a position to accomplish, was very much the result of something he had nothing to do with. Simply the boon of being born in America. What was true for him is also true for every one of us. Our ancestors moved here instead of there. I was in the right place to meet the right person. I had the right professor who happened to take an interest in something I was studying. The events of our lives come from a combination of our own decisions and something or things we had no control over whatsoever. Something that came to us not because we earned it, but because of a moment of grace. A moment, as Rabbi Dorff put it, when we were granted something far beyond what we had earned. After all, isn't this what we're really hoping for when we come here for the High Holy Days? We come to the synagogue seeking forgiveness for the things we have done wrong, but can forgiveness ever really be earned? Is it ever something about which we can honestly say, I worked for that forgiveness, I deserve to be forgiven? I believe that forgiveness, whether it comes from God or from another person, is nothing less than an act of grace. Yes, we must apologize. Yes, we must make restitution if it is possible. And yes, we must promise ourselves and God or the other person that we will do everything we can to make sure it doesn't happen again. But even after we take those steps, in the end, when God or our friend or our loved one is willing to forgive us, to allow us back into their good graces, it is never truly because we can say, you have to. After all, I deserve it. We don't deserve it. We are lucky to get it. The choice to forgive, even after we have offered atonement, is an act of kindness, a gift of grace given to us despite whatever it is that we have done. Just imagine for one moment going through life carrying an ever-growing pile of sins on our back with no way to put it down, no way to rid ourselves of that burden. Life would very quickly become unbearable. There is forgiveness. Forgiveness is an undeserved gift without which we could not go on. We come here on the High Holy Days because we hope and we believe that we might receive that grace from God. We apologize to others in the hope of receiving that gift from the people in our lives. We desperately want it, even knowing that there is nothing we can do to truly deserve it. My friends, knowing that about ourselves, knowing about the forgiveness we are craving, how dare we do any less than offer that gift of forgiveness to those who seek it from us? Not because they necessarily deserve it, but simply as an act of grace, offered by one to another, because we know that both we and they are created in God's image. As we stand here tonight on the cusp of a new year, my prayer for each and every one of us is, Ya'er Adonai panav elecha v'chuneka, may God grant us more than we deserve, and may we do the same for one another.